Welcome, everybody, to another episode of DWP Digital's podcast. My name is Stuart, and today we're discussing our use of ephemeral environments to help our teams develop and test their solutions in a safe, self-contained ecosystem. So let's jump in. Stuart, Carl, and Phil, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Okay, yes. So my name's Stu Cairns. I prefer that rather than Stuart. So I'm currently the Deputy Director, Head of Engineering within Health and Disability. But I've been within the civil service for about 5 years now, run across a few different directorates. I was the Head of Hybrid Cloud Services for a short period of time. Before that, the Tech Lead within retirement. Previously to that, it was all very much private sector, building online learning platforms for students across the world, and sort of really fancied a change and kind of looking to what the public sector are doing, particularly how we are looking to transform our services and putting citizen needs at the heart of everything we do. And that's very much where we are going now within the health world, because part of my responsibility is about developing and delivering the technology strategy for major government projects such as the Health Transformation Programme, which currently is delivering 2.2 million assessments a year. But we also have a number of other services such as Access to Work and New Style ASA, which, although they are entirely separate benefit lines, actually, from our point of view in this conversation today, they actually have to co-locate in the same technology ecosystem, which therefore creates the challenges, which means we have to have isolation and separation. Fundamentally, all accountabilities within this space from a technology and security point of view and the related practices fall under me, and we are sort of ever growing stronger. So that's me in a nutshell.
Hi, so my name is Phil Harle. I'm a lead DevOps engineer in the Health Directorate. I've been working with DWP for around about 4 years now, originally by a private consultancy before joining and working directly with them. I've been within health for a couple of years, but worked across the department in a few different guises prior to then. Actually, prior to joining DWP, I've worked in a few different sectors as well. So local government, I spent quite a bit of time in higher education, but also working across private sector in IT consultancy and kind of fintech roles. Most recently, my focus has really been around cloud platforms and kind of adding automation into software engineering work streams, but I do come from quite a heavy kind of infrastructure-led background, so adding a very operational and kind of live running element into the role too.
Hi there, I'm Carl Hoggins. I'm a lead software engineer sitting in health and health directorate within DWP. I've been with DWP for probably around 5 years now. Probably the last couple working in health, and then in a range of PDUs before that. Before I joined DWP, I had a stint working in an airline and worked in the IT there. Was delivering kind of mobility solutions for pilots. So we worked a lot on kind of iPad apps and making paperless cockpits, which was quite interesting. Going back even further, my background is probably more hardware focused. So coming from kind of microprocessor design and microelectronics, and then into kind of hardware, software interfacing, and then took the path of software engineering from there. And more recently, being a lead software engineer, it is trying to promote good engineering practices and standards across health and wider DWP, and try and break down some of the barriers that we have between our different engineering families as well.
So let's talk a little bit about your team and the service you support.
So the health and disability team is basically an entire PDU within the wider DWP context, and we deliver health-related benefits and the sort of attached digital services as part of that. The team is now scaled to 25 agile multidisciplinary teams. That's circa about 300 people, and they work across citizen-facing services, ones for our healthcare practitioners, and when we're talking about things like a health assessment service, for example, as well as internal DWP agents. Regardless of who the end user is, though, we need to make sure that we are fitting our the user needs, thinking about the citizen and the heart of everything we do. The purpose of this is to transform our complex internal legacy estate into a modern microservice cloud native architecture, which does put all of those flexibilities at the heart of what we want, and making sure we are thinking about how we can achieve the best services for our citizens ultimately at the end of the day, but also having a cost thought as well, because ultimately we don't want to waste taxpayers' money. The team remits are split between those focused on end products, so they'll be the services which people will be interacting with directly, but also we've got a core part of what we call the enabling teams. The remit of these are to put in the foundations in place to allow the product teams to succeed ultimately. Part of this is the creation and standardization around ephemeral environments, which is what we're going to be talking about today, and the standardization around our deployment processes. And the idea here is that the product teams don't need to keep reinventing the wheel around this, and removes the cognitive load of them sort of trying to face up the challenges of how to get base functionality from a development laptop all the way through into production. We sort of take that on in a more holistic view within health and disability.
The team that I sit on, kind of touching on what Stu said, is one of the enabling teams. So kind of building out our reusable platforms, our shared code bases, the things that we can actually spread across multiple product teams. But also the nature of my role means I do kind of get involved with a lot of the other feature-led teams. So trying to set standards in terms of engineering disciplines, in terms of the DevOps culture and the way we kind of work across the teams as well.
I sit in one of the enabling teams in health. So we do a lot of the enabling, setting standards, patterns, and promoting reuse across health. So we work within the team, but with a lot of teams as well. And as Stu mentioned, trying to reduce that cognitive load and providing a lot of reuse so teams can accelerate through to getting their products and changes into live. I think beyond that as well, we do look to try and influence as far as possible. So we, based on our learnings, we do publish patterns for wider reuse across DWP and try and share our code for reuse as well to allow that benefit to stretch beyond the realms of health.
So what are ephemeral environments, and how are people using them across the industry?
So an ephemeral environment is quite often referred to by a number of different names. So you might hear them kind of called short-lived environments, dynamic, temporary, on demand, but essentially they're all the same thing. And at the most basic level, an ephemeral environment is simply an environment that isn't long-lived, and instead it only exists for a defined period of time. And in terms of what we mean by an environment, it tends to be a collection of infrastructure or services to enable someone, whether it be a development team or otherwise, to deploy their components, their applications into. Ephemeral environments started to appear generally around the kind of first wave of virtualization, and organizations kind of dabbled with them, specifically when they had like on-prem services, but there was definite limitations in kind of what could be delivered on-premise. So really the kind of emergence of ephemeral environments came when cloud kind of came to fruition, and this truly enabled us to harness the elasticity of cloud to deliver environments kind of at a rapid pace, on demand, scale to whatever needs the development teams need.
The key thing around for me is that it's the concept of them being domain context bound, so you're able to. It stretches from where we currently have the idea around sort of Docker containers, for example, as being something you can just throw away. This is extending that to a collection of components which live together for a specific purpose, but it doesn't remove the fact that you can then throw them away and destroy them. They will come up, be used for whatever purpose they're needed, and then they're gotten rid of. That is fundamentally being enabled by the fact that cloud is entirely API driven. So you can create whole ecosystems on the fly just through infrastructure as code, for example, and then deploy your units, use it in the way you need to use it, and then blow it away. So
I see ephemeral environments as an extension to kind of commodity hardware. We've talked about the advancements of cloud and cloud, hardware being API driven. Commodity hardware throwaway hardware. And this is another layer, another kind of layer on top of that, where you get your groupings of your commodity hardware into an environment. Again, API driven, requiring automation, but essentially it's that next tier of groupings of commodity hardware into a commodity environment that you can't throw away when you no longer require it.
So how long have we been using these environments, and what's our setup?
Okay, so it's probably been a couple of years since we started using ephemeral environments in Anger. In terms of setup, that's quite a difficult one to answer. So ephemeral environments, as we mentioned before, are throwaway environments, and you need some kind of wider foundations to get the best use of them. So you need some automation and some infrastructure as code that define your environments and allow you to stand them up in a repeatable way. So what that essentially means is we can vary our setup. So we invest in our foundations and get that foundational platform, so we can create ephemeral environments as and when needed. And then it's largely config to define what size we want, what scale, what hardware, software. So we can vary that as and when required to meet the needs. So we can have, if we're doing feature development, and we're working with teams on a team of developers or multiple teams, they can all have quite small scale environments. Don't need to cost a lot, but they can do whatever proving the need. Whereas we might decide to spin up a full size kind of prod-like environment to do some performance testing, or might choose to do that, on a schedule. We might do it every night. So we've got that configurability to do exactly what we need and to meet the needs.
So just to build on what Carl was saying, so we have been investigating it for a little while. It became part of health and disability sort of technology strategy the middle of last year. And it is, as Carl was mentioning, because of that total flexibility that it enables us, we can go from anything from tiny end developer sort of just proving out their feature full through to complete replication of what a live state looks like, to do formal load testing, all of which is encapsulated within the exact same processes. So from the beginning of what we're trying to do within development, it actually effectively looks exactly the same as how it operates within production. And it's that sort of building up. So that's kind of where, when we say it's difficult to answer the exact question about what the size and scale currently is, it's because we can range it to whatever our use case is for a given moment.
What advantages do ephemeral environments have over the longer life environments, and why have we chosen to use them specifically?
So I think the initial advantage is the removal of constraints. So just to put a bit of kind of setting the scene on this one, I'm sure as engineers, we've all been in a situation where the development lifecycle is often stalled due to maybe the QA environment being used to test something. That gives you an inability to kind of develop and deploy and test your features because someone else is using it for their purpose. Or there could be scenarios where maybe there's specific versions of the application deployed on some fixed infrastructure to support maybe some third-party testing or something that's going on. And again, that prevents you from being able to kind of test and develop and prove the things that you need to do. So really, with ephemeral environments, what we're trying to do is remove that constraint. We don't want fixed infrastructure. We don't want a fixed number of environments. We want to kind of build and scale these to the needs of the product and the needs of the development team. So in smaller teams, yeah, they might only have one or two kind of spun up at any one point in time. Whereas if we're working on maybe multiple feature teams working together on the same application, they may have dozens of environments being built. And equally, the same applies all the way through the development lifecycle. So it's not just development, it's testing as well. Let's say we need a full-size production-scaled environment to do some performance tests on. But let's say another team also comes along and says, well, I want to run something on that performance test environment. Well, we're not constrained by having a performance test environment. Basically, we treat that as a type of environment, and we'll just provision another one. So it enables us to kind of run parallel development, life cycles, be able to run parallel tests, and effectively what we're trying to do is just increase teams' velocity.
It also, because of the sort of short-lived nature of some of these things, it creates these huge possibilities around doing things like user research. So rather than having prototypes being done in isolation of a real live running environment, we are now able to actually, alter a user journey, put it out in a non-production environment, and allow for user research to get done against that. The reason for that is the fact that these things will only exist for a handful of hours or a day, say, whilst those research sessions are going on. Then they are obliterated. So if, in the unlikely event that there was some form of compromise from a security point of view, the blast radius is actually greatly minimized, because these things don't live for a long period of time. They're just there for the one purpose, which gives us that extra flexibility in making sure that we use the technologies for what we wanted to, but also leverage the learnings and move everything to the left, because we want to make sure that we're getting that sort of quick ecosystem changes building in right from the beginning, rather than having everything go up to production before we can do some of these user research sessions or accessibility testing points of view.
So I was just going to mention that ephemeral environments can have benefits in terms of config drift. So I'm sure we've all got experience of where we deploy to one environment and everything seems to be okay. So maybe we're deploying to dev and everything seems fine. And then when we start promoting through the environments towards prod, so maybe we get into staging or something like that, and things start breaking and blowing up. We don't know why, and it's because something's been iterated in the dev environment that hasn't been replicated or consolidated in code, and that used to happen quite a lot. By using ephemeral environments and kind of the codified nature of them with automation, so all environments are essentially the same, it kind of removes that possibility to have config drift. So there's a real benefit there over long-lived environments. And I was also just going to mention the kind of the cost versus risk factor as well. So again, I'm sure many have been in the situation where it might have been really nice to do some volume tests, but actually that means we're going to have to spin up a performance test environment that needs to be full scale, or it's going to take a while to do that with infrastructure guys needing to be on hand to help. So we might not do it. We might carry some risk forward and hope things go well, or we might try and infer some metrics out of scaled environments. Again, we don't need to worry about the time that's going to need to build this extra environment. It's all automated and codified. We don't need to worry about kind of interpolating results either. We can have full scale environments or environments of any config as and when we need them, and we only pay for their uptime, and then we destroy them once they're gone. So there's benefits in that regard.
Carl, what's prod?
So prod is production. So this is the live running services that will be accessed by our end users or citizens or internal users.
The reason why we are so focused on getting into prod or production is because that's the point that you realize the value of your effort. It doesn't matter how brilliant the code is, the user experience, or the mechanisms that create an environment are. If it's not released into production, it's not being used by citizens, agents, end users, you're not actually realizing the value of all that effort. And that is why that is really a key focus for all of the teams, and why we put in the foundational work to make this happen.
So which of our services are using ephemeral environments? What types of things are we testing? And what impact have you seen from a user, service, or customer perspective?
About 70% of the services are now currently utilizing them within health and disability. So we've got New Style ESA, the health assessment service, Tell Us About Terminal Illness, and FitNote are now all fully on board with this. All new work will be using this approach by default. And we currently have migration plans in place and being acted for access to work and PIP apply. And they'll ultimately bring them all into alignment over the course of the next sort of 6 months, I imagine. In terms of benefit, we've been able to move to regular release cadences. So most teams are now releasing weekly. So as soon as we sort of get user research information that lets us, improve a service. We can get that through development. We can put it through the pipelines. We've got obviously all the automation through the testing cycles, and people can release as are needed because of that standardization through both the creation of the environment and the deployment of it. We're able to actually, if we need to, release on the same day basis as well, which is quite a shift from where the department used to approach things with sort of long lead-in times, where sort of it's allowing us to move everything to the left, get our assurance, because we're designing for production right from the beginning all the way through to the end.
I think, as Stu touched on, one of the key benefits comes out from the increase in cadence that we can deliver to citizens. But I think if we take this all the way back to the left as well and look at some of the benefits that we get as engineers ourselves, I think we've often been traditionally in scenarios where a developer might kind of build their features and do their updates and things, and it works in their local development environment. But often when they then promote that and try and run it on a real infrastructure and run some tests against it, or even kind of at the latter stages where it's making its way to production, there's often been instances where failures have occurred because the environments have differed. But I think that one of the key benefits of kind of implementing this pattern is because we've got a single code base stand-up infrastructure that's not only used for development and testing, but it's the same code that actually provisions the production environments. If a developer comes along and wants to actually do something, we can effectively build them a production environment. So if they can develop a feature and get it all functional and tested and approved in a non-production, in a test environment, we stand a really good chance that by the time that comes to being deployed in production, it's just going to work because effectively it's all deploying on the same infrastructure.
Ephemeral environments kind of form part of a wider kind of set of foundations and automation that allow our regular release cadence, plus also kind of benefit our engineers as they're working through their features as well. So there is some work in foundations. So things do need to be codified. We try and cut manual process out as far as possible. We do need things as code, so they are repeatable and they can be executed as required. But because we've got that automation in place, when we build these environments as well, we can slot things into that automation. So we can run tests. We've talked about tests. We can run them after an environment's built, but we can also do other things. So we can do various security checks, security scans. We can smoke test our environments to make sure that everything looks good and healthy. So that's all great, and that's a pattern that our engineers can adopt and reuse, so they don't have to reinvent that every time. But they are in control as well, so we try and empower our teams. So while they've got a starting point and they've got that pattern and code for reuse, they are in control of their own kind of services. And while we set standards, they can adapt their automation and their codified infrastructure to meet their specific needs as well.
We've also seen the use of ephemeral environments extend far beyond just development and testing as well. And what we've seen is that this isn't really the exclusive domain of engineers and techies. We've got good examples of kind of content designers and business analysts spinning up their own environments. They might be using these to kind of run demos, maybe undertake training sessions, but a lot of this has actually been enabled because we've automated the process of spinning up an environment. So where traditionally, if you wanted an environment, you'd maybe have to speak to an infrastructure guy or a DevOps guy or something to kind of book their time and get them to actually do something for you. Because we've got this single code base and this automated tool chain to enable us to effectively press a button. So it's self-service. That someone can come along, and as long as they've got permission to do it, they can press a button and self-serve themselves an environment, use it for whatever they need to do it, as I say, to run demo or training session or so on. And then at the end of the day, that thing's automatically destroyed. So really, by removing that human dependency, we've not only sped up delivery, but we've actually seen some other benefits in terms of other users who traditionally wouldn't be accessing these sort of environments.
DWP looks after a wide variety of services and products, How have we managed to cater for all of the different setups, scales, and nuances?
Yeah, so ephemeral environments aren't just for modern greenfield development. Prior to working within health, we did actually, a small number of our engineers were working on replatforming one of DWP's other kind of legacy monolithic applications. And it was here that we kind of cut our teeth on developing and improving the initial ephemeral patterns that subsequently we've adopted inside of health. That application was, as I say, kind of a large application. It was written using technology that wasn't necessarily cloud native, but we were still able to implement ephemeral patterns and using kind of automated test pipelines and modern tooling, even though the actual application technology underneath that powered it might have been considered legacy. Of course, it's kind of not without its challenges in doing this, and there is a degree of investment in time that's needed to develop the infrastructure as code, develop the pipelines, and everything else to support it. And certainly when we're talking about older applications, especially those when maybe there's licensed software in the mix, it becomes a little bit more difficult, especially if we take, for example, maybe you've got a licensed database component and you can't necessarily license this on an hourly basis. So the idea of potentially spinning up dozens of ephemeral environments and then someone being landed with a bill and go, well, actually, we need to buy dozens of licenses to fund these. It doesn't necessarily kind of have that synergy. But there are some creative solutions that you can employ in terms of maybe in kind of more environments to the left of the life cycle that you might be putting mocks in there, or you might be having feature toggles that turn off some of these more expensive license components. And a lot of this, again, can be automated. So a developer might be working in a development environment that they kind of build and cut through their pipeline. And then once they've proven their feature in their environment, once it gets promoted through the tool chain to an environment, a test environment to the right, that's when some of these license components may be enabled. And again, that can be fully automated.
How secure are these environments? What measures do we have in place to make sure the test environment stays as a test?
So by the very nature of them being short-lived, purpose-specific, they are very secure. Even if compromise does occur, we can obliterate and redeploy the whole estate that has been compromised. By having that, the blast radius of what can be taken down is greatly reduced. Add to that the fact that we always do things like blue-green deployments within production, so that as things need to sort of replicate, there's no impact to end citizens in terms of what they see. We can, as standard, if we wish, cycle the whole ecosystem on a nightly, technically hourly basis if we needed be. Through this has all been through obviously our internal security processes to make sure that we're conforming to all relevant standards. We've obviously been pushing the standards out as well to sort of make sure we adopt a strength and depth approach across the estate, so making sure that we have a number of commensurate controls within not just sort of running environments, but our data access layers, so that by layering up different controls, we actually simplify the state and make it more supportable, but also strengthen the security posture because we are constantly under attack due to the fact that we are a government organisation. And we hold a large amount of citizen personal information, which we need to take very seriously at every stage, regardless of where we are in the sort of system life cycle.
Yeah, so ephemeral environments aren't just of the domain of kind of development and test as well. We do deploy ephemerals into production. So as has been kind of briefly mentioned, we use the blue-green pattern in production. So whilst production is longer lived in a sense of it's available 24/7 and our citizen services are available 24/7, the underlying environments that we deploy into could be changing all the time. They could change on a daily basis or as and when we do deployments. And the idea of when we promote from our non-production environments into our production environments, we're not necessarily promoting into a live, already built production environment. Quite often what we're doing is we're taking our infrastructure as code base and building a brand new production environment. So it's all fresh, it's nice and clean, and we know what the steady state is. And then once we're happy that that deployment's been successful, then we'll automatically flip over and our live traffic will come into that new production environment. But what that does then mean is the old one that had previously been running, that gets terminated. And if there was any sort of kind of security issue or compromise on it, the termination of that environment kind of cuts out that angle of attack.
Yeah, so I was just going to talk a little bit about how environments are isolated. So yes, we can have ephemeral environments. We can have as many as we need. Stu and Phil have mentioned that they can be at different points in the delivery life cycle. So we still use ephemeral environments in prod, but we blue green them. They're just slightly longer lived. And previously I talked about how easy it is to create environments. Click a button or create a branch if you want to make a change. We have got some controls around our release process and making those changes into our prod account. So we have got separation of duties. So while it's really easy to get started and start developing, once all of your changes are proven, we have got a release process in place with kind of segregation of duties that make sure that we go into production in a controlled manner, and we create the new ephemeral environment and do the blue-green switch over in a really controlled and prescribed manner to reduce any risk. We invest in foundations of our designs for ephemeral environments. We do a lot of work up front, and we design for prod. So yeah, we might be spinning up kind of dev type environments for very initial feature development. But all of our design thinking is for prod. This thing's going to end up in prod at some point, and all of our environments are the same. So let's not cut features out in the early stages and leave ourselves open to risk or significant change later on. Let's think about all the things we need to consider and bring them forward. What that means is you do spend time on the foundations, but that's time well spent because then you can accelerate through the different stages of deployment.
How quickly are the teams adopting ephemeral environments, and how have they found them in practice?
Within health, we started small, but we always knew that it was something that we'd like to actually roll across the entire directorate and get all of our applications on board with it. So whilst our kind of initial proving and kind of build out of the foundations was done on a single application, this was really to make sure that we invested enough time in those foundations and made sure that the patterns and the implementation code and everything else that underpins it was reusable across all of our applications in health. So from having maybe only 2 or 3 projects at the start of the year, we're now in a situation where on a daily basis we've got dozens of environments being spun up by teams within health throughout the day, and we've got projects kind of in the pipeline who are ready to adopt this approach as well. And it's very much been a bit of a kind of self-service effort for the teams as well. As we touched on, we work as part of an enabling team, so we built the patterns and we built the standards and the code fragments and the like that underpin this, but very much the intent was to empower teams to actually adopt this themselves. So it's not an effort that requires engineering kind of input centrally. It's very much a case of here is the pattern and here is the implementation architecture. Now you as a team can self-serve and implement this yourself. When
we did start off quite small within health, we realized that it was going to go further, or we'd like it to go further. So we did invest in we made sure that we invested in documentation and templates and quick starts and all that kind of stuff, so that there wasn't the single point of failure. You needed to go and talk to a group of people. This is all documented, and it's kind of good to go with references for teams to pick up when they start this work.
What challenges have we faced with the rollout of these environments? What would you do differently, or what would you look to improve in the future?
So I think one of the key challenges that we faced and still continue to face is quite often when teams need to interface with third parties. And this tends to be third parties who don't necessarily follow the same patterns around ephemeral environments and may operate kind of more fixed infrastructure. So to kind of put some context around this, if we are developing features that interfaces with these third parties, quite often we need to run tests between our environments and their environments. But if they run on fixed infrastructure, quite often we might have to book time to actually give us a slot on their environment, make their engineers aware that they need to deploy certain versions of their components. And ultimately, this kind of lacks the flexibility that we might otherwise have from a self-contained point of view. So whilst maintaining ephemeral environments within health, within our own domain and within different applications and products within the health domain, we certainly are afforded this flexibility. But when we start interfacing with maybe other teams within the department or externally who don't necessarily implement the same sort of patterns, this can kind of cause us some sort of issues.
So one of the things I would do differently, if I was to have my time again, would be to invest a bit more upfront in really bottoming out the value statement of doing this foundational work. We did hit some resistance from teams who wanted to sort of continue on the journey they were currently on, and it took a while for us to be able to show and demonstrate actually, all the key benefits. And we did that largely through by, as Phil mentioned earlier, starting small with an exemplar project, and we're therefore able to demonstrate it. I think if I would have my time again, I would have probably sort of tried to come up with more materials and narrative to sell that story up front without actually having to have done the physical execution of that work. I would recommend for people listening to the podcast, though, if they're interested in learning about any of these things, to come and speak to the teams, getting a real life viewpoint of how they find operating this new way of working, because it is quite a big mindset shift. You really are going to the left on lots of things, and that does lead to a change in your ways of working, your cultures, your practices, as well as sort of the base technology that makes it all happen.
So what advice would you give to others who are considering the implementation of ephemeral environments?
I think a lot of it touches on what we've spoken about previously in terms of kind of articulating the value and identifying the benefits, because as we say, this is quite an engineering undertaking, but it isn't just a tick box exercise. And the change of culture that comes with actually implementing this can reap significant rewards. But it does need buy-in, as every cultural change in an organization does. It can't just be done in a silo. It does need to be kind of, everyone needs to be involved in that change.
It's just about embracing that we do need to push a lot of things left. We need to think about things up front, invest in the foundations, and yes, there's definitely work there. We've talked a lot about automation. That's a key part. There's always requests, we haven't got time to test that, we'll just do a manual test. In this situation, anything of that creeps in, if that nature creeps in, then you're kind of broken your flow. You've broken that end-to-end journey of automation, and until that's repaid in terms of that debt, you've broken your process. So yeah, I guess my advice would just to be as Stu said, just be razor sharp on automation, and don't let any manual process sneak back in to your flow.
Start by talking to us, the team, looking at our example projects, so as well as all the documentation we've got, which there's a wealth of. We've got exemplar actual real world environment product, which then can be used and leveraged for your own purposes to sort of learn from. Definitely, you need to have a mindset of not wanting to have manual processes in any part of this. If you start introducing manual processes, you basically break all the benefits of going down that road. So you have to be really lightning focused on automation through every aspect and finding ways to do that. And sometimes that's more natural and easier than others, but leverage the wider DWP engineering community, as well as obviously those within health to help you on your journey.
So just before we end, how would you like to see ephemeral environments being used in the future?
So I think really I'd like to see ephemeral environments become the standard. Don't get me wrong, we're not the only ones within DWP that implement an ephemeral environment, but it still very much feels like we're the exception rather than the norm. And with that comes some of the challenges that we've already spoken about in terms of interfacing with other teams and kind of doing those kind of more complex integrations. And if we could break down some of that manual effort that teams are doing at the moment and automate it and have the flexibility to spin up environments on demand and kind of connect to them and run tests between them, it really does take us one step closer to automating the entire tool chain, all the way from a developer checking in code to that actually being deployed in production in a kind of repeatable, assured, but hands-off way.
I would like to see it become the default position. This is what we know and use, and everyone's aware of it. We mentioned mindset earlier, so it'd be great to see that mindset shift and everybody get on the same page, so we don't have to kind of repeat the conversations when we get new joiners or we're talking to other teams within DWP that we need to interface with around, or can we deploy this change to QA? That's not a thing anymore. You're in control. You can deploy it to whatever environment you want. Having everyone on that same page and pulling the same direction, singing from the same hymn sheet would be an excellent place to be.
For me, having that sort of as a base standard across the department gives us that real flexibility as engineers need to move between teams if they're all used to the way of working, the practices, the standards, the processes. That really empowers us as engineers to go across, work in different environments, solve problems, and not have to worry about learning how does the whole ecosystem operate in this part of the company.
So that ends our podcast for today. Hit the subscribe button if you want to make sure you don't miss our next episode. And I'd like to thank Stu, Carl, and Phil for taking part today. It's been really interesting to hear about our ephemeral environments and how they work. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time on the DWP Digital Podcast.